Imagine a single microscopic cell, entirely engineered in a laboratory. It doesn't come from nature. Its DNA was quite literally typed out on a computer and printed. And it possesses exactly 473 genes.
Not one gene more, not one less.
Right. It is the absolute mathematical bare minimum required for a biological organism to exist, grow, and divide. Today, we're crossing the boundary from, studying life to actively programming it.
Which fundamentally changes our definition of what is natural, what is manufactured. I mean, it raises incredible questions about what happens when this biological software eventually interacts with the real world.
Welcome to the Daily Deep Dive, the 3D initiative of UPSC with Saurabh Kaushik. If you're joining us today, you already know our mission. We take a dense, high-yield stack of sources spanning governance, culture, the economy, and cutting-edge science, and we extract the absolute must-know insights.
We're looking for the mechanisms behind the headlines.
Exactly, for your preparation and honestly, just to feed your curiosity.
And we have a massive stack to get through today.
We really do. So whether you're commuting, prepping for a meeting, or just going for a walk, let me give you the rapid-fire index of the 16 topics we're unpacking today. Ready?
Go for it.
Okay. 1. Odisha's highly controversial 20 lakh electoral roll deletions. 2. The easing of India's emergency gas curbs post-Hormuz. 3. A colossal rural fund release under the VBG-RAM-G scheme. 4. The passing and, frankly, incredible legacy of Pandavani folk legend Teejan.
That's a fascinating one.
Okay. 5. India's dual BRICS diplomacy on drugs and women's empowerment. 6. The desperate push for a second home for Asiatic lions. 7. The intersecting crises plaguing India's fisheries. 8. An editorial analysis on the right to belong. 9. India's economic resilience and OPEC plus output shifts. 10. The biological reasons heat stress is devastating Gangetic milk production.
Which is a huge hidden crisis.
Yeah, totally. 11. That revolutionary lab-made synthetic cell we just mentioned. 12. The global oil calculus right now. 13. Why ethanol blending is our fastest decarbonization tool. 14. INS Sudarshini practicing naval diplomacy in New York. 15. ISRO testing a vital Gaganyaan component. And 16. The paradox of Hyderabad topping the charts for informal workers.
It is a vast terrain to cover, but everything here is deeply interconnected.
Let's jump right into the deep end with the rural economy. Our sources detail a massive release of funds under what's known as the VBG-RAM-G scheme. Union Minister Shivraj Singh Chauhan has just unlocked the first installment of 25,863 crore rupees to various states.
Yeah, and to understand the weight of that number, we have to look past the acronyms and, look at the sky. We're currently facing a 35% monsoon deficit.
Which is massive.
It is. For context, Indian agriculture is heavily dependent on the Kharif season, the monsoon crops like rice, maize, and cotton. When the rains fail to arrive, the entire rural economic engine just shudders to a halt.
So let's break down exactly where this 25,000 plus crore is actually going. Because, throwing money at a drought doesn't work if it's just sitting in a state treasury somewhere.
Exactly. The breakdown is highly targeted. 12,400 crore is dedicated exclusively to the wage component of MGNRGS.
That's the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme.
Right. This is the government's flagship program that guarantees 100 days of wage employment to rural households. They're ensuring a minimum flow of about 300 rupees a day. Then you have 8,000 crore for rural housing under PMAG, the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Gramin.
Okay.
And another 3,200 crore is for rural roads under PMGSY, and over 2,200 crore for the National Rural Livelihood Mission, or NRLM.
I want to push back on that employment guarantee for a second, though. If you're a farmer and your fields are parched because of this 35% rainfall deficit, your local private employment, like hiring hands to sow seeds or pull weeds, that just evaporates overnight.
Yeah, it completely disappears.
So how effective is this MGNRGS injection when the fundamental agricultural activity isn't even happening?
Well, that is precisely why MGNRGS was designed in the first place. It acts as the employer of last resort. When private agricultural labor dries up, the state steps in to pay workers to build public assets, digging ponds, building check dams, or repairing local roads.
Oh, I see.
It operates as a macroeconomic shock absorber. If those wages aren't paid, rural demand collapses. People stop buying soap, bicycles, biscuits. The entire FMCG fast-moving consumer goods sector feels the pain of a dry monsoon.
So this is an emergency liquidity injection, but the notes mention a strict conditionality. Like the central government isn't just handing over 25,000 crore blindly.
Far from it. The center is demanding that states establish district-level convergence committees, and they've given a hard deadline of August 15, 2026.
Independence Day.
Yes. Andhra Pradesh is actually the launch state for this specific oversight model. The logic here is about preventing siloed bureaucracy.
Right, where different departments don't talk to each other.
Exactly. Historically, the department building the rural road doesn't talk to the department building the rural house, and neither talks to the employment guarantee scheme. By mandating these convergence committees, the center is forcing cooperative federalism. They're essentially saying, hey, we will provide the liquidity to reach 6 crore rural households, but you, the state governments, you must build the administrative architecture to ensure these funds compound each other rather than leak away.
It's an attempt to engineer efficiency in the middle of a climate crisis. And speaking of engineering international cooperation, the notes highlight India's current role as the BRICS 2026 chair. What caught my eye isn't just that we are hosting meetings, but where we're hosting them. We have the heads of anti-drug agencies meeting in Guwahati and simultaneously the Women Working Group meeting in Kochi.
This is a masterclass in geographical diplomacy. In international relations, the host city is a message in itself. Let's look at Guwahati in Assam. It sits at a highly strategic and, frankly, highly vulnerable geographic choke point.
Because it's flanked by the two largest drug-producing regions on the planet.
Exactly. To the west, you have the Golden Crescent, comprising Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan, which is traditionally known for opium and heroin. And to the east, the Golden Triangle, which includes Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand.
Right.
But the threat matrix has evolved. It's no longer just organic opiates. The region is seeing a massive surge in synthetic drugs like methamphetamine and fentanyl, combined with all the complexities of dark web trafficking networks and cryptocurrency laundering.
So by placing the Narcotics Control Bureau leadership and the entire BRICS anti-drug apparatus right there in the Northeast, India is physically anchoring the discussion in the frontline reality of the threat.
It grounds the policy in the geography. Meanwhile, over 2,000 kilometers away in Kochi, Kerala, you have a completely different diplomatic track running parallel.
Kochi is a huge hub for maritime commerce and digital literacy.
Right, and there the BRICS Women Working Group is focusing on the digital economy, women's economic empowerment, and gender-responsive climate policy.
I see the contrast. It's like a computer operating with a dual-core processor. You have the hard security processor in the Northeast tackling cartels and synthetic compounds, and the soft power socioeconomic processor in the South looking at climate and digital equity.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
It demonstrates to the BRICS nations and the broader global South, really, that India's multilateral leadership isn't just a one-trick pony. We can manage defensive security postures and offensive development goals simultaneously.
Exactly.
Let's stay on this theme of massive systemic shifts. Our third source brings us to the ethanol-blended petrol program. The government is pushing aggressively for E20 by 2025-26. And right now, the national average is E14, meaning our petrol is blended with 14% ethanol.
The economic and environmental math behind this is staggering. By moving to these blending targets, we are substituting crude oil imports to the tune of $5 billion annually. Furthermore, over 90,000 crore rupees are being routed directly into the hands of farmers who supply the raw materials.
Let's slow down and look at the mechanics of this, because I think a lot of people, they pump gas and have no idea what ethanol actually does inside their engine. How is adding alcohol to fuel helping us decarbonize?
Well, at a molecular level, ethanol contains oxygen. When you blend it with petrol, that extra oxygen allows the fuel mixture in your engine's combustion chamber to burn more completely.
Okay, and a more complete burn means?
It means fewer unburned hydrocarbons and significantly lower carbon monoxide emissions. We're talking about a 35% drop in carbon monoxide for standard vehicles.
But wait, if we're just pouring alcohol into traditional engines, doesn't that cause damage? I always assumed older car engines weren't built to handle corrosive organic solvents.
That's a very valid concern, and is why the rollout is phased. Moving from pure petrol to E10 or E14 is generally well tolerated by standard internal combustion engines. But as we push toward E20, vehicles require slight material modifications in their fuel lines and engine tuning.
To handle the higher alcohol content without degrading the rubber and plastic components.
Exactly. This is why you see automakers rolling out specific flex fuel compatible vehicles now.
Okay, so the engine chemistry works, but what about the agricultural economics? If we're suddenly demanding billions of liters of ethanol, where is it coming from? Aren't we risking a food versus fuel crisis by diverting edible crops into our gas tanks?
The government has actually been very careful to balance this. Historically, 90% of the ethanol has come from sugarcane, specifically the molasses byproduct that remains after sugar extraction or direct sugarcane juice in years of surplus.
Right.
But to hit E20, they are diversifying the feedstock. They're now utilizing surplus grains like damaged rice and maize that are unfit for human consumption.
Yeah.
It turns agricultural waste into an energy asset.
It's an invisible revolution for the consumer. I mean, you don't have to buy a $50,000 electric vehicle or wait for a hydrogen grid to be built. The refinery just changes the mix, and your daily commute instantly becomes 14% less dependent on foreign oil.
Precisely. It is the most immediate, pragmatic decarbonization shortcut available to us today.
And while we're on the topic of reducing our reliance on foreign oil arriving by sea, India's naval presence is projecting a very different kind of power across the oceans. The notes mention that INS Sudarshini recently arrived in New York for the U.S. 250th Independence Day celebrations, which is part of an event called Lokayan 2026.
This is a really fascinating exercise in maritime diplomacy. INS Sudarshini isn't a destroyer or an aircraft carrier. It is a sail training ship.
Right, like an old-school sailing ship.
Exactly. It has 3 masts, relies on the wind, and is used to teach cadets the fundamental ancient arts of seamanship. So navigation by the stars, handling rigging, understanding ocean currents without relying on digital sensors.
Sending a traditional sailing ship past the Statue of Liberty for America's 250th anniversary, it feels incredibly intentional. But why not send a nuclear submarine to show off our military might?
Because soft power is often way more persuasive than hard power. A warship signals threat and defense. A majestic sail ship signals heritage, shared maritime history, and goodwill.
That makes sense.
Yeah, when INS Sudarshini docks in New York Harbor, it becomes a floating embassy. It invites public tours, cultural exchange, and nostalgia. It's a brilliant, low-friction way to cement the Indo-U.S. strategic partnership.
From the global projection of our maritime history to the deeply internal struggles of our cultural history, let's pivot to a deeply moving tribute in our notes today. Teejan Bai, the absolute legend of Pandavani folk art, passed away at the age of 70 at Ames, Raipur.
Her legacy is a testament to the sheer, unstoppable force of human resilience. To understand what she achieved, you have to understand the immense, almost suffocating social gravity she had to escape.
Right.
She was born in 1956 in a small village called Gangetic in Chhattisgarh, into the party community.
And the history of the party community is fundamentally tied to one of the most oppressive legal mechanisms of the colonial era.
Yes, the British enacted the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871. This was a piece of legislation that essentially criminalized entire communities by birth.
Let me stop you there, because the mechanics of that sound impossible to modern ears. How does a law make a newborn baby a criminal?
Well, the colonial administration was obsessed with categorizing Indian society. They decided that just as certain castes were traditionally weavers or blacksmiths, other nomadic or forest-dwelling communities were inherently genetically predisposed to crime.
That is just wild.
It was. If you belonged to a notified tribe under this 1871 Act, you were forced to register with the local police. Your movements were strictly confined. You needed a pass to leave your village. You could be arrested on mere suspicion without a warrant simply for existing outside your designated area.
That is structural oppression and engineered right into the DNA of the state.
Absolutely. The act was finally repealed by independent India in 1952, and these communities were officially denotified, hence the term denotified tribes or DNTs. But you cannot erase 80 years of institutionalized stigma with a single signature.
Of course not.
So when Teejan Bai was born in 1956, her community was still treated with deep suspicion and prejudice by broader society.
So she is born into this massively marginalized reality. How does she go from that to becoming an international icon who performed in Paris and London and eventually receiving the Padma Vibhushan, India's second highest civilian award?
She did it by breaking the gender rules of her own culture's art form. Pandavani is the traditional Chhattisgarhi folk retelling of the Mahabharata. Historically, it was the exclusive domain of men. There are 2 styles of performance. The first is Vedamati, which is highly formal, classical, where the narrator sits down and sings the verses.
And then there's the Kapalik style.
Right. The Kapalik style is visceral. It is performed standing up. The performer moves, shouts, acts out the dialogue, and improvises heavily. Teejan Bai was the first woman to master and perform the Kapalik style.
I've actually watched archival footage of her. It is electric. She holds a tambura, a traditional stringed instrument, but she doesn't just play it. The mechanics of her performance transform that physical object. 1 second she's strumming it to set a melody, and the next second she raises it over her head, and it becomes Bhima's mace, or she pulls it back, and it becomes Arjuna's bow.
She possessed this uncanny ability to channel the ancient theatrical energy of the epic. She bypassed formal education and formal musical training, relying instead on raw, emotive power.
Wow.
Yeah, even when she performed in Germany or Japan to audiences who couldn't understand a single syllable of the Chhattisgarhi dialect, they were completely mesmerized by the universal language of her performance. She took a marginalized identity and forced the world to respect it through sheer artistic brilliance.
A true pioneer. And our notes also include a tribute to another figure who dedicated his life to fighting structural marginalization, albeit through a very different mechanism. We are marking the birth anniversary of the late Ramvilas Paswan.
Paswan is a fascinating study in the mechanics of Indian democratic power. He was an 8-time member of parliament from Hajipur in Bihar, and he holds an astonishing record. He served as a union minister in 6 different central governments.
6 different prime ministers: VP Singh, Dev Gowda, Gujral, Vajpayee, Manmohan Singh, and Narendra Modi. Political commentators often called him the barometer of public mood, implying he was a weather vane who just aligned with whoever was winning.
But that critique fundamentally misunderstands his strategy. Paswan was a champion of the Dalit and EBC, the extremely backward classes politics. But his structural approach was very different from someone like Mayawati in Uttar Pradesh.
How so?
Well, Mayawati sought to build a massive, overarching Bahujan umbrella encompassing various marginalized castes to achieve an absolute majority. Paswan's approach in Bihar was hyper-focused. He primarily consolidated the vote of the Dusad or Paswan community, which accounted for roughly 6 to 7% of the electorate in Bihar.
Okay, but how does 6% get you into 6 different cabinets?
In the incredibly fragmented multi-party landscape of Indian coalition politics, a solid, unshakable 6% vote bank is invaluable.
Right, because in a 3-way race, that 6% is the margin of victory. It becomes coalition currency.
Precisely. He understood the mathematical leverage of his base. He didn't need to win 50% of the vote to wield power. He used that concentrated support to ensure that regardless of which national alliance, left, right, or center formed the government, his party was essential to their majority.
That's incredibly strategic.
By ensuring he always had a seat at the cabinet table, he maintained a continuous inside track ability to advocate for Dalit rights, push for reservations, and direct state resources to his constituents.
Teejan Bai used the tambura to demand dignity, and Ramvilas Paswan used coalition mathematics. Both were responses to historical marginalization. But that transitions us to a highly sensitive topic in our notes today, because while historical marginalization was often based on birth or caste, modern marginalization is increasingly bureaucratic.
We're referring to the electoral roll deletions in Odisha. This is perhaps the most constitutionally dense issue we will cover today.
I am. Now, before we get into the mechanisms of this, I need to be completely transparent with you, the listener. The source material we're working from contains intense political accusations. The Congress Party is alleging a deliberate suppression of voters, while the BJP insists it is a standard legal cleanup of the rolls. We are absolutely not taking a political side here. We are not endorsing either narrative. Our goal is to impartially examine the data and the constitutional law surrounding this event.
And that is the only responsible way to analyze this. Let's look at the raw numbers. Odisha recently conducted a special intensive revision, or SR, of its draft electoral rolls. Following this exercise, 20.14 lakh names were deleted.
That equates to roughly 6% of the entire state's electorate.
It does.
Just to provide some baseline context, the notes mention that Manipur recently saw a deletion rate of about 7.6% during a similar exercise. But the sheer volume in Odisha, 2 million people, is what's triggering the scrutiny. How does a state legally delete 2 million voters?
The chief electoral officer provided a categorical breakdown, and the mechanics of these categories are where the debate lies. First, 8.32 lakh names were deleted due to death. That is a standard, undeniable necessity for maintaining an accurate roll. A further 1.58 lakh were removed as duplicate registrations, again, a vital procedural cleanup.
Right. But here is the sticking point. Over 1 million voters, 10.07 lakh people to be exact, were deleted under the category of shifted or absent.
This is where the constitutional alarm bells start ringing. The revision process relies heavily on the BLO, the booth-level officer. These are usually local government employees, like teachers, tasked with physically going door to door to verify residence.
So a BLO knocks on a door. The person isn't there. Maybe they're a seasonal agricultural laborer who migrated to Surat to work in a diamond polishing unit for 6 months. Or maybe they're a student studying in Delhi. If they aren't physically present when the BLO visits, does their right to vote just evaporate?
That is the exact fear driving this controversy. And the Supreme Court of India anticipated this exact friction. Just recently, on May 27, 2026, the Supreme Court issued a clear mandate regarding electoral rolls.
What did they say?
They stated unequivocally that the Election Commission cannot automatically delete a voter simply for failing to re-enroll or for being absent during a verification drive.
Because absence does not equate to a loss of citizenship.
Exactly. The Supreme Court mandated due process. Before a name is struck off the list, the election authorities must issue a formal notice, hold a hearing, and provide a clear opportunity for the citizen to appeal. Stripping a citizen of their vote is a massive state action. Article 326 of the Constitution guarantees universal adult suffrage. You cannot allow a clerical assumption of absence to override a fundamental constitutional right.
It's like treating your voter ID as a VIP club pass that the bouncer can revoke if you aren't standing right at the entrance, rather than treating it as a permanent receipt of your inherent constitutional citizenship.
That analogy captures the tension perfectly, and it is precisely why the Election Commission of India has intervened by appointing 10 senior IAS officers as independent electoral roll observers, specifically for Odisha.
Right.
The ECI recognizes that the stakes are monumental. Beyond the political mudslinging, the integrity of the democratic process hinges on ensuring that not a single eligible, marginalized, or migrant voter is disenfranchised by a bureaucratic technicality.
This friction between the citizen and the state's paperwork is explored beautifully in our next source, an editorial from The Hindu titled "The Right to Belong Beyond Official Documentation." It ties directly into what we just discussed about Odisha.
The editorial poses a profound question about the nature of the modern Indian state. Have we reached a point where possessing documentation has become the actual definition of citizenship, rather than merely evidence of it?
Let's unpack the mechanics of that distinction. If I have a birth certificate, that's evidence I was born. But if I lose the certificate, it doesn't mean I was never born.
Precisely. If documentation is just evidence, the underlying truth of your citizenship born on Indian soil to Indian parents, embedded in the culture, remains intact even if the paper is lost. But if the state operates as though documentation is the definition of citizenship, then a missing Aadhaar card or a mismatched name on a voter ID means you cease to legally exist. You become a ghost in the eyes of the government.
The editorial uses a specific phrase, the paperless Indian. Our sources estimate that somewhere between 10 and 15% of India's adult population lacks complete matching documentation. Who are these people?
They aren't undocumented immigrants across the border. We are talking about highly indigenous populations. Think of nomadic pastoralist communities like the Gujars and Bakarwals in the Himalayas, whose lifestyle defies permanent addresses.
Right, they move with the seasons.
Exactly. Or think of elderly tribal populations deep in the forests of central India, where the modern bureaucratic apparatus simply never reached them when they were born. Or the millions of interstate circular migrants who constantly shift between rural villages and urban slums, losing paperwork to floods, fires, or evictions.
So when a state demands rigid chronological proof of existence, like we see in these special intensive revisions, these communities are structurally penalized for their poverty and their mobility. The editorial draws a very sharp parallel here to the National Register of Citizens, the NRC, in Assam.
The Assam NRC is the ultimate case study of this documentation paradox. In 2019, the final NRC list excluded 19.06 lakh people. Now, while the political intent was to identify illegal immigrants, the rigid bureaucratic mechanics ended up ensnaring massive numbers of genuine long-term residents of Assam.
Because they couldn't produce the specific legacy documents dating back before 1971?
Yes. The state placed the absolute burden of proof on the individual. If your grandfather's name was spelled slightly differently on a 1965 land deed compared to a 1970 voter list, the bureaucracy flagged you. The editorial argues that this hyper-documentation-centric approach is fundamentally flawed in a nation like India, where historical record-keeping has been deeply uneven and inherently biased against the poor.
So what is the alternative? How does a modern state maintain security and accurate rolls without disenfranchising the vulnerable?
The editorial suggests flipping the presumption. Right now, if a BLO doesn't find you at home, The presumption leans toward exclusion. The editorial argues the default stance of the democratic state must be inclusion. If there's a discrepancy, the state must provide robust legal aid, guarantee a minimum 60-day appeal window, and actively assist the citizen in proving their identity, rather than just stamping deleted on their file.
It's a sobering look at how fragile our political survival can be on paper. Let's shift our focus to the physical survival of our economy, because just as citizens rely on paperwork, our economy relies on incredibly fragile global supply chains. A few months ago, India faced a quiet but severe crisis regarding natural gas, and our sources note that the center is finally lifting emergency curbs on liquefied natural gas, or LNG.
This situation was a textbook example of how a geopolitical tremor thousands of miles away can instantly shut down a factory in India. Back in April, tensions flared around the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical maritime choke points in the world, located between Oman and Iran. A massive percentage of the world's LNG passes through that narrow waterway.
And India is highly exposed here. The notes indicate we import roughly 50% of the natural gas we consume.
We are hyper-dependent. When shipping insurance rates skyrocketed and tankers delayed their routes to avoid the Hormuz tensions, India's gas supply was immediately choked. The central government had to step in and invoke the Essential Commodities Act of 1955.
Which is essentially an economic triage mechanism.
Exactly. When supply plummets, the free market would usually dictate that prices skyrocket for everyone. But gas is too critical. So the government mandated a strict hierarchy of usage. They prioritized domestic households, your kitchen cooking, gas and CNG for city transport to prevent mass public panic.
But the gas has to be diverted from somewhere. Who got cut off?
The industrial sector took the hit. Non-domestic consumers, specifically the glass manufacturing industry, ceramic factories, and crucially, gas-based power plants and fertilizer producers had their LNG supplies drastically curtailed.
But now the notes say the curbs are lifted. What changed the geopolitical math?
Diplomacy and normalization. Specifically, the Muscat Accord reached in mid-June helped stabilize the shipping corridors. Qatari and Saudi LNG tankers are now safely traversing the strait again. We can track this recovery mathematically. During the panic, spot prices for LNG spiked to around $18 per MMBTU.
That's metric million British thermal unit, the standard measurement for gas.
Right. And today, those spot prices have crashed back down to a normalized $11 or $12. The massive import terminals at Dahej and Hazira in Gujarat are operating at standard capacity again.
It's a relief, but it exposes a terrifying vulnerability. If a localized conflict in the Middle East can force Indian ceramic factories to shut down, our energy security is essentially out of our control.
It underscores the urgent necessity of the ethanol blending program we discussed earlier, as well as our massive investments in solar and wind.
Speaking of global energy calculations, the notes mention that OPEC Plus just concluded a meeting and decided to increase oil output.
Yes, OPEC Plus, which includes traditional OPEC nations like Saudi Arabia, alongside allies like Russia, agreed to boost their collective output by 548,000 barrels per day, starting in August.
Why the sudden increase? I thought OPEC's general strategy was to restrict supply to keep prices high.
It is a delicate balancing act. During the Hormuz disruption, several key producers lost market share as buyers scrambled for alternative sources. Now that the shipping lanes are clear, heavyweights like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are turning the taps back on to recapture those buyers and assert their dominance in the global market.
And as a net importer of crude, I assume more supply is purely good news for India.
Broadly, yes. Increased global supply puts downward pressure on Brent crude prices. Lower crude prices eventually translate to a lower import bill for the Indian exchequer, which helps control inflation and stabilizes the rupee.
We've been talking about putting all our economic eggs in one basket with imported gas. Let's talk about a biological version of that exact same problem. Topic 9 details a truly existential crisis for one of India's most iconic animals, the Asiatic lion.
This is a scenario that keeps wildlife biologists awake at night. If you want to see a wild Asiatic lion today, there is only one place on the entire planet you can go. The Crore forest and its surrounding agropastoral landscapes in the state of Gujarat.
So the entire global population, about 700 individual lions, lives in a single, geographically isolated pocket.
It is the biological equivalent of keeping your entire life savings in a single bank branch built directly on a tectonic fault line.
But why is that so dangerous? Aren't they protected there?
They're brilliantly protected by the Gujarat Forest Department, but you cannot protect against microscopic threats or natural disasters. The primary issue is a severe genetic bottleneck.
How bad is the bottleneck?
Back in 1913, Hunting had decimated the Asiatic lion down to a mere 20 individuals. Every single one of the 700 lions alive today is descended from those 20 survivors.
Which means they are highly inbred.
Exactly. They have incredibly low genetic diversity compared to their African cousins. This lack of genetic variation means their immune systems are dangerously uniform. If a novel virus enters the population and one lion is susceptible, it is highly likely that all of them are susceptible.
And we've actually seen this fault line crack, haven't we? The notes mention 2018.
Yes, a devastating outbreak of canine distemper virus, or CDV. It's a highly contagious RNA virus that affects the respiratory and neurological systems. It swept through Gur and killed 23 lions in a matter of weeks. The government had to urgently import vaccines from the U.S. and isolate dozens of lions. A single forest fire, a severe cyclone, or a mutated virus could literally wipe the entire subspecies off the face of the earth.
So the obvious solution is to move some of them. Take 30 lions and put them in a different forest to create an insurance population. The notes state the Supreme Court literally ordered this to happen back in 2013. The plan was to move them to Kuno National Park in Madhya Pradesh. Why didn't it happen?
Because conservation science collided head-on with state pride. For Gujarat, the lions are a massive source of cultural identity and a lucrative tourism monopoly. Successive state governments legally and politically resisted the Supreme Court mandate to transfer any lions to Madhya Pradesh. They argued that Madhya Pradesh couldn't guarantee their safety from poaching.
They stonewalled the transfer for a decade, and then the landscape fundamentally changed in 2022.
It did, because Crore National Park, which spent 25 years relocating villages and prepping its habitat specifically to receive lions, was suddenly chosen as the site for Project Cheetah. African cheetahs were flown in and released into Kuno.
And you can't just drop Asiatic lions into a territory that African cheetahs are currently trying to adapt to. The lions would outcompete or kill them, so Kuno is effectively off the table for the lions now.
Exactly. So we are back to square one with the lions in danger. However, the editorial in our sources outlines a highly pragmatic intrastate compromise. Barda Wildlife Sanctuary.
Where is Barda?
It is in Gujarat, roughly 190 kilometers away from Gur, near Porbandar. Ecologically, it is highly suitable for lions, with good prey density and similar terrain, but politically it is the perfect solution because the lions never cross the state border.
Ah, I see.
Gujarat retains its absolute monopoly on the species, state pride is preserved, but from a biological standpoint, you establish a geographically distinct founder population. If a virus hits Gur, the Barda lions are far enough away to remain safe.
It is amazing how much of wildlife conservation is actually just managing human political egos. Let's move from the forests of Gujarat to the deep waters of our coastlines. Topic 10 outlines a massive, intersecting triple crisis hitting India's fisheries sector. We have 14.5 million people in India whose livelihoods depend on fishing. We are the third largest seafood producer in the world, but the system is fracturing.
It is a textbook case of tragedy of the commons, accelerated by climate change. The first and most immediate crisis is brute overfishing in our shallow coastal waters. The data is grim. The biomass, the total weight of the living populations of key commercial species, like the Bombay duck, Indian mackerel, and various prawns, has declined by 20 to 40% since the year 2000.
We're simply pulling them out faster than they can reproduce, and the notes point out a bizarre irony. The Hormuz crisis we discussed earlier actually made this overfishing worse.
It's a chain reaction. Because of the security threats in the Arabian Sea, massive international commercial shipping dropped. Simultaneously, the Indian Navy increased its deep-water patrols. This meant large-scale, deep-sea trawling operations were halted or severely restricted for safety.
Oh, wow.
As a result, all that fishing effort concentrated inward, rushing into the shallower, safer coastal waters, massively accelerating the localized overfishing.
So that's the first crisis. What's the second?
Climate change. The Indian Ocean is warming at an accelerated rate. Fish are highly sensitive to thermal changes. They are migrating to deeper, cooler waters or shifting their breeding grounds entirely. Furthermore, the frequency and intensity of cyclones have spiked, which ruins fishing days and destroys the physical boats and nets of artisanal fishers. And the third crisis is geopolitical. Resource competition from foreign industrial-scale trawlers illegally entering the fringes of our waters.
Now, here's what I find fascinating. The government isn't ignoring this. The notes detail the Pradhan Mantri Matsya Sampada Yojana, the PMMSY, which is a massive 20,050 crore rupee scheme. We also have the Deep Ocean Mission. But there seems to be a massive disconnect between where the fishers are and where the government wants them to go.
You've hit on the central paradox of India's blue economy. We have an exclusive economic zone, an EEZ, that covers 2.37 million square kilometers of ocean. It is a vast, largely untapped territory. Yet the vast majority of our 14.5 million fishers operate only within 50 kilometers of the coastline. We're stripping the shallow waters bare while ignoring the deep.
Why don't they just sail further out?
Because a traditional wooden boat cannot survive 200 kilometers offshore. Deep-sea fishing requires massive capital steel-hulled vessels, advanced sonar, cold storage chains. The government's PMMSY aims to subsidize this transition, hoping to unlock a billion-dollar deep-sea export market.
That sounds incredibly expensive.
It is. Furthermore, the Deep Ocean Mission is deploying Matsia 6000, a manned submersible designed to dive 6,000 meters deep to explore deep-sea biodiversity and mine polymetallic nodules.
The ambition is incredible, but the socioeconomic friction is huge. You can't just hand a deep-sea trawler to a community that has spent 1,000 years fishing estuaries in small boats and expect an instant transition.
Precisely. The challenge isn't just technological. It's about reskilling millions of traditional workers before the shallow waters collapse completely.
And climate change isn't just forcing fish into deeper waters. It is fundamentally altering the biology of our terrestrial agriculture as well. Topic 11 is a study that honestly blew my mind. Milk production in the Gangetic Plains, the dairy heartland of India, has dropped by 14 to 18% since the year 2000.
This is a silent crisis documented in the journal Nature Climate Change. India is the world's largest producer of milk. 80 million rural livelihoods depend directly on dairy, but we are hitting a biological thermal wall.
The notes highlight a metric called the THI, the temperature-humidity index. Explain how this mechanism works in a cow.
The cow, or a buffalo, is essentially a walking biological fermentation vat. They possess a massive stomach chamber called the rumen, where bacteria break down tough grasses. This fermentation process generates a massive amount of internal body heat.
So they're already running hot on the inside.
Yes. Now, mammals cool down by transferring internal heat to their skin and sweating or panting it away into the surrounding air. But when the external temperature-humidity index crosses 27 degrees Celsius, the air is too hot and too saturated with moisture to absorb the animal's body heat. The animal enters severe thermal stress.
And how does that impact milk production?
Biology goes into survival mode. To stop producing internal heat, the cow simply stops eating. Less food means less energy for lactation. Furthermore, the animal's heart pumps blood away from the internal organs, including the udder, where milk is synthesized, and pushes it to the skin to try and cool down. Fertility plummets. Milk yield can crash by 10 to 30% in a matter of days.
And the climatological data for the Gangetic Plains, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, West Bengal is alarming. The study notes that a THI above that critical 27-degree threshold now occurs for over 150 days a year.
To put that in perspective, in 1970, it was only 60 days a year. The climate has fundamentally shifted. The dairy farmers are facing a triple stress: erratic monsoons ruining the fodder crops, extreme heat stressing the animals, and severe groundwater depletion making it impossible to cool them down.
So what is the adaptation strategy? We can't exactly put 80 million cows in air-conditioned sheds.
No, we can't. The primary scientific intervention is genetic. The National Dairy Research Institute, ICAR-NDRI, is working aggressively on climate-resilient crossbreeds. They've developed breeds like the Caron Fries and the Caron Swiss.
How do those work?
It is biological optimization. They are crossing the high-yield genetic traits of European dairy cows, like the Holstein Friesian, with the inherent thermal tolerance and disease resistance of indigenous Indian breeds like the Tharparkar or Sahiwal. It's a race to rewrite the animal's biology fast enough to survive the changing climate.
Which brings us perfectly to topic 12, our final major subject before we hit the space and urban developments. And frankly, this is the most science fiction concept in our stack. We are talking about the creation of the synthetic cell.
We touched on this at the very beginning of the show, but the implications require a deep dive. Scientists at the J. Craig Venter Institute have successfully created and booted up a synthetic cell named JCVI Syn3A.
Okay, I need to understand the exact mechanics of this. When you say synthetic, do you mean they built a tiny robot that looks like a cell?
No, it is entirely biological. It's a living, squishy, organic cell. What makes it synthetic is its DNA. In a normal cell, DNA is passed down through billions of years of evolution. Here, scientists designed a genome on a computer. They selected the exact sequence of A, C, T, and G base pairs they wanted, and then they essentially printed that DNA sequence in a lab using chemical synthesizers.
They typed out the code of life and printed it. But how do you get printed chemicals to come alive?
They used a technique called genome transplantation. They took a naturally occurring bacterium and they biochemically destroyed its original DNA, leaving behind an empty cell membrane.
Think of it like an empty hardware shell, a computer with no operating system.
Exactly. Then they injected their printed synthetic DNA into that shell.
And it booted up.
It booted up. The synthetic DNA took over the cellular machinery, and the cell began to live, metabolize, and most importantly, divide and reproduce.
But the breakthrough here isn't just that they made it work, it's the size of the genome.
Right. They wanted to answer a fundamental question. What is the absolute minimum amount of genetic code required for life? They took their synthetic genome and began deleting genes one by one. If they deleted a gene and the cell died, they knew that gene was essential. If they deleted it and the cell lived, it was extraneous.
And they stripped it all the way down to exactly 473 genes.
For context, a human cell has over 20,000 genes. Even simple bacteria have thousands. They found the baseline, the absolute minimal biological operating system.
Why does this matter outside of a laboratory?
Because once you understand the minimum, you can build custom organisms with incredible precision. Imagine taking this minimal cell and adding just 5 specific genes that instruct the cell to consume atmospheric carbon dioxide and excrete bioaviation fuel. You have just created a microscopic, living, self-replicating fuel factory.
That's incredible.
Or you add genes that allow the cell to navigate the human bloodstream and hunt down cancer cells, delivering a payload of medicine directly to a tumor.
It's programming, but instead of silicon, the medium is biology. And the notes point out that India is heavily invested in this. The Department of Biotechnology and the Department of Science and Technology are funding synthetic biology research at institutions like IGB in Delhi and NCBS in Bengaluru. But I have to play devil's advocate here. What happens if this biological software gets a bug?
That is the ultimate bioethical concern.
If a synthetic cell with a completely alien, lab-created genetic code accidentally washes down a sink and enters a natural river ecosystem, it has no natural predators. It has no evolutionary context. It could multiply and disrupt the ecosystem in ways we cannot even model.
Which is why the governance of this technology is paramount. The international framework managing this is the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, which governs the movement of living modified organisms across borders. But regulatory frameworks move at the speed of bureaucracy, while synthetic biology is advancing at an exponential Moore's Law pace. We're entering an era where we have to manage the risks of playing creator.
From the frontiers of biology to the frontiers of space. Our sources briefly touch on topic 15, an update from the Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO. They are currently testing a vital component for the Gaganyaan mission, India's inaugural human spaceflight program.
While the exact component testing varies week to week, the current focus for Gaganyaan is heavily centered on the human rating of their systems. It is one thing to launch a satellite. It is entirely another to ensure a human can survive the violent acoustics, vibrations, and thermal extremes of a rocket launch.
I understand they've been rigorously testing the crew escape system. Can you explain the mechanics of how that works?
The crew escape system is essentially an emergency ejection seat for the entire space capsule. If the main LVM-3 rocket detects a catastrophic failure, say an engine explosion on the launch pad or during the early ascent, the escape system instantly fires its own rapid burn solid motors.
It basically pulls them out of danger.
Yes. It rips the crew module away from the failing rocket, propelling it several kilometers into the air, safely away from the blast radius, before deploying parachutes for a water splashdown.
It requires split-second autonomous decision-making.
Exactly. The sensors must detect anomalies in milliseconds. It is the ultimate insurance policy for our astronauts, and ISRO is subjecting it to extreme abort scenarios to ensure a near 100% reliability rate before they put an Indian in space.
We end our deep dive by returning to Earth, specifically to the urban landscape. Topic 16 notes a fascinating and somewhat counterintuitive demographic reality. Hyderabad has topped the charts for having the highest proportion of informal workers among India's big cities.
It is a striking paradox. When we think of Hyderabad or Cyberbad, we picture towering glass offices, massive IT parks, multinational tech giants, and a highly formalized white-collar workforce.
So how does a tech hub simultaneously become the capital of informal labor?
Because the formal economy generates a massive, invisible shadow economy. The thousands of IT professionals migrating to Hyderabad require infrastructure. They need apartment complexes built, they need gig economy delivery drivers to bring them food, they require domestic help, and they need private transport.
Ah, I see. The boom in the formal tech sector directly fuels an explosion in informal support roles.
Precisely. You have a massive influx of migrant labor feeding the construction sector to build those IT parks and luxury apartments. These workers operate entirely outside formal contracts. They have no provident fund, no health insurance, and no job security. The gig economy platforms further accelerate this by classifying thousands of delivery personnel as independent contractors rather than employees.
So the glittering skyline of Hyderabad is essentially subsidized by the precarious labor of its informal workforce. It brings us full circle, in a way, back to the marginalized populations we discussed at the beginning of the show.
The threads always connect.
Let's take a breath and synthesize the immense ground we've covered over the last hour. We started with the VBG Ramji rural funding acting as a multi-thousand crore shock absorber against a failing monsoon. We tracked India's dual-core BRICS diplomacy from the drug trafficking crossroads of Guwahati to the digital economy in Kochi. We saw how blending ethanol is quietly decarbonizing our commutes, while INS Sudarshini uses sails and wind to project soft power in New York Harbor.
We explored the cultural defiance of Teejan Bai's Kapalik performance and the precise coalition mathematics of Ramvilas Paswan.
We navigated the deeply sensitive constitutional friction of Odisha's 2 million electoral roll deletions, and we unpacked the philosophical peril of the paperless Indian struggling for the right to belong. We watched global supply chains react to the Hormuz crisis and OPEC plus output bumps. We looked at the desperate search for a second home for all genetically bottlenecked Asiatic lions in Barda, the triple crisis suffocating our shallow water fisheries, and the biological thermal wall devastating milk yields in the Gangetic plains.
And we looked at the bleeding edge of human ambition, from ISRO testing the abort mechanics of the Gaganyaan mission to scientists booting up synthetic life with just 473 genes, all while grappling with the massive informal workforce building our most advanced cities.
It is an overwhelming amount of information, but the patterns are clear, and I want to leave you, our listener, with a final, provocative thought to mull over. Today we talked about the synthetic cell. We talked about how scientists, using extreme precision, have narrowed down the absolute mathematical minimum biological code required for life to exist, just 473 genes. They figured out exactly what makes a cell belong in the category of the living.
Which is an incredible feat.
Yet, as we saw with the millions of names deleted from the Odisha electoral rolls and the editorial on the right to belong, we as a society are still deeply struggling to define the minimal social code required for human belonging. If our scientists can define the exact flawless parameters of biological existence in a laboratory, why is it so incredibly hard for our bureaucracies to recognize the existence of the paperless citizens living, breathing, and working right in front of them?
That is the defining question of modern governance.
It truly is. Thank you for giving us your time today. Keep questioning the mechanisms of the world around you. Keep looking past the acronyms and keep diving deep into the facts. We will be right here with you next time to unpack it all. Stay curious.